Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. All right, so we've all adjusted our times. We're doing better. We're ready to kind of get going. I'm excited to be here with y'all today. So first, I am excited to welcome you today to our presentation, Virtual Team Meetings, a Tool Worth Keeping in the Care Coordinator's Toolbox. My name is Molly Lopez, and I'm here with Intact to make sure you feel welcome and ready to engage. I'm going to keep our housekeeping really brief, but I want you to note a few different ways to engage in our discussion today. First, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining us from in the chat. You'll find the chat in the menu running up and down on the right-hand side. And it's the two little square speech bubbles. And then just under the chat feature is the Q&A pod. And that's the best place to send questions for our speaker. We're going to stop and kind of let her respond to some of those questions as she goes. And then lastly, feel free to use the emojis at the bottom of our screen to share feedback with her as well. So without further ado, I am pleased to present our speaker for this session, Dr. Camille Barnes. Dr. Barnes is a senior research scientist and evaluator with the Center for Human Services Research. So welcome, Dr. Barnes.
Thank you, Molly. Hello, everybody. As Molly mentioned, I am an evaluator and I work mostly on system of care grants. So I have done that for about the past 8 years here in New York State for both state level and county level system of care grants. And if you are familiar with New York State, we are housed in the State University of New York, University of Albany, so in the state capital of Albany, New York. And thank you for joining us today to learn more about our findings and some of our state data on virtual team meetings. So I first wanted to provide a little bit of context about sort of what our data is, what service it's around, and a little bit of information about our project. So what I'm going to be talking about today is data around high fidelity wraparound. So there's many different models of care coordination, of course, one of them being high fidelity wraparound, which is a team-based process that's really sort of holistic and really team-based and serves youth generally that have complex mental health challenges and are multi-systems involved. So a pretty high needs group. And in New York State, we are currently on the second of our system of care expansion grants. So New York State has had system of care expansion grants since 2016. And there's a few reasons why virtual care, which is what I'll be talking about today, is particularly sort of challenging for this population and in this location. So sort of serendipitously, we did a system of care statewide survey in February of 2020. So right before COVID hit, we had some data, and the service that had the lowest level of implementation in the state was telehealth services. So it just shows that that was really a challenge in the state. Organizations were having trouble getting telehealth services going or chose not to develop them for whatever reason. So when COVID-19 happened and the stay-at-home orders occurred in the state in March, they really had to adapt very quickly and figure out how to provide these services, how to fidelity wrap on via telehealth. Another challenge because of high fidelity wraparound is just it's a really complex service. As I mentioned, it's team-based, and often for youth with multi-system involvement. So there's just a lot of formal providers on a team often, sometimes informal support people, the family, the provider. So it's not just a provider and a family, you have just a lot of people that you need to coordinate. And finally, as I already mentioned, that it serves youth in New York State with high needs. Only the highest acuity youth are able to receive high fidelity wraparound in New York State. So that just adds another layer of difficulty with providing the service in a virtual way. But the way that COVID-19 sort of happened and stay-at-home orders happened all at the same time across the state, it sort of created like a natural experiment where you had services provided all in person and then all of a sudden they had to switch. So it's interesting from a researcher perspective to sort of see what we can learn from that natural experiment. So to provide some context, I wanted to share with you a timeline of what the services looked like for our state. As you can see, the quarter two of 2020, we switched entirely from the green in person to the yellow virtual services and with a little bit of phone. So you can see it took a little bit of time for people to sort of get that those Zoom platforms or Teams platforms in place or whatever sort of infrastructure they were using. So some of the providers had to use phone to provide services for that first sort of quarter following the switch from in-person to virtual care. And then you can see there's kind of a slow decline in virtual services. So around quarter two of 2021 or winter of 2021, we start seeing in-person services go up and virtual services go down. And then finally in quarter two, so the spring of 2022, we see a crossover where we're having, again, more in-person services and fewer virtual services. But still, we're seeing sort of a mix of both of those types. And this is our current quarter. This was quarter four of 2022 when I looked at the data. So 60% of these wraparound meetings were happening in person, 39% happening virtually, with 1% happening via the phone. And just to provide a little bit more context, this graph is showing the average percentage of in-person meetings. So the counties that are in darker green are having more in person, lighter green have fewer in person. And you can kind of see, this map is helpful too, also to see where we have these high value wraparound services, where the data is coming from. So it's sort of clustered in the Hudson Valley, New York City area, but there are other sites that are more rural. We hit northern New York, western New York, downstate, and Hudson Valley and Capital Region. So many areas of the state are represented in this data. And I wanted to look at this in a map to see, hey, are we seeing virtual meetings all happening in the city? Are they all happening in rural areas? How's the distribution looking? And you can see that it's not really clustered in any way. We're seeing a variety of in-person meetings, both in very rural areas and very urban areas, as well as everything in between. So something more is at play than just sort of regional distribution. So the areas that I'm going to talk about today are mostly characteristics that are associated with in-person versus virtual meetings. So who are we seeing that's choosing sort of, or getting, I guess, more in-person versus more virtual meetings? Impressions and outcomes. So are virtual meetings feasible? Are they likable? Are they impacting some of our outcomes of high fidelity wraparound? And also some advantages and disadvantages of the different meeting modes. And the data I'm going to talk about has come from several different sources. So data on meeting administration experience comes from surveys with both agency administrators and care managers, which are our providers. And that data is coming from the spring, summer of 2020, so sort of early on in COVID-19 times. And our meeting participation experience, we have 350 survey responses from youth and caregivers, and those are from January 2021 through November of 2022. And then I'm going to present some predictor and outcome data as well. And this data is going to come from our program records starting in January 2021. So I only did some of the later data. So it was at the point where everybody was not doing only virtual meetings. It's kind of the point where there was a variation in the virtual versus the in-person meetings. And this data also only includes youth that had 3 or more meetings in that time period. So our first section, we're going to look at some characteristics that were associated with the proportion of in-person meetings. So our first characteristic that was a significant predictor of whether you were having more in-person or more virtual meetings was formal supports. So the more formal supports that you had on your team, the more the lower percentage you had, of in-person meetings. So this graph shows that teams that had fewer formal supports had on average 67% of their meetings in person, whereas the teams that had more formal supports had on average 43% of their meetings in person. Another variable that was predicting the percentage of in-person meetings was living in a rural location. So the teams that were located in a more rural location tended to have more in-person meetings, 66%, whereas those who were located in a less rural area tended to have only about 36% of their meetings in person. And our final characteristic that predicted the percentage of in-person meetings was learning limitations. So focal youth that had greater learning limitations tended to have more in-person meetings. So 66% of their meetings on average were in person versus the youth with lower reported learning limitations having about 38% of their meetings in person. So these variables make a lot of sense sort of intuitively. Your teams that have more formal supports, it's more difficult to coordinate. So they're going to be more likely, it'll be a little easier maybe to do a virtual meeting. The youth that maybe have high learning limitations may not be able to participate as well with a Zoom meeting. So they may be more likely to be in person. And the rural, we're seeing with the youth that are in more rural locations having sort of more of these in-person meetings, either it's the family preference or the provider preference, or we're not really sure why, but that is showing up in the data. So the next section, I'm going to look at if virtual meeting delivery seems to be feasible. So based on the youth and caregiver interviews that were completed by phone, 90% reported that the video meetings are easy to use. 94% reported that the group was able to communicate well in the video meetings. So those are pretty promising. In addition, one of the things we really were concerned about in the beginning was, which was also just mentioned if you were on the keynote with the rural discussion of rural populations, that connectivity and equipment can be a big challenge, especially connectivity in our state. There's a lot of dead zone areas. So we were curious to see what the participants' responses were on these items. And luckily, they didn't report, or it wasn't often reported, that there were challenges with connectivity, with about 92% of participants reporting they had reliable internet or data available to use video meetings, and 93% reporting that they had a device or equipment that they could use to participate in virtual meetings. But you can have all the resources and we still may not like virtual meetings. So this is another important question to ask our participants. So 93% reported that they were open to joining video meetings in the future. And 55%, though, only 55% reported, or reported they still preferred an in-person meeting over a video. So we're not seeing a ton of barriers to using virtual meetings, but there still seems to be some magic that's happening in those in-person meetings where people do still prefer them in general over a virtual meeting. I also wanted to look at in virtual meetings. Sorry, it says I have a connection disruption. Molly, do you hear me? Oh, Molly, do you hear me now?
Yes, you're fine. I got
Okay.
the same message, so I'm not sure what that means.
Okay, let me get my spot. Don't look. Okay. So I wanted to look at too if virtual meetings impacted outcomes, because we want to make sure that if the service is delivered in this virtual way, that they're still getting a premium service, and that there isn't sort of a deficit on the outcomes for those youth that are receiving the service in a virtual way versus an in-person way. So I looked at meetings completed. So youth that had more virtual meetings actually had more meetings completed at about 7.79 meetings versus those with high in-person meetings completing only 6.22. So that makes a lot of sense. Virtual meetings can kind of happen on the fly versus in person. There needs to be more coordination. So this finding was pretty intuitive, but still helpful to see. And then meeting frequency, also probably for similar reasons, was associated with meeting mode, where those with high virtual meetings had meetings with about every 48 days, whereas the teams with more in-person meetings had meetings about every 52 days. So about 4 days sooner for those experiencing more virtual meetings. And I also wanted to look at what meeting mode was not associated with, which is phase at discharge. So for high fidelity wraparound, there's 4 phases: engagement, plan development, plan implementation, and transition. And we note the phase at which people are at when they graduate or leave the program. And the phase was not impacted by whether they had more virtual or more in-person meetings, and other important outcomes also were not impacted. So youth graduated at a very similar rate, depending on if they had more in-person or more virtual meetings, and there was also no impact on out-of-home placement at discharge from services. So now we get to some of the fun stuff, the advantages and disadvantages of virtual care coordination. We're going to look at some of the findings from both the providers and our participants on what they felt were the advantages and disadvantages of virtual care coordination. So to summarize, and then I'll show you some quotes. Some advantages are you don't need to travel, so it cuts down on commuting time. Also, if there's sort of dangerous driving conditions, you don't have to deal with it, traffic, things like that. Meetings are still possible when they would otherwise be canceled. Upstate New York, we get a whole lot of snow, often making services difficult. Also illness, things like that. Providers can join for part of the meeting. So providers may have a very busy schedule. They may be able to only join for 5-10 minutes of the meeting. They could come in, provide their input, and then leave the meeting and still participate when they otherwise maybe would not be able to. Gives the family some options. So just keeping that family voice and choice at the forefront. We want to give families options in how they prefer their services and how they're best able to receive those services. And there are also some video features that may be preferred in some cases. So this slide shows some of our participant reactions. So I'll just kind of summarize, but if you want to read the quotes yourself, that also might be interesting. So the participants remarked on how in times of illness, they prefer in person. Also, a participant had a new baby in the home. Understandably, they didn't want a lot of other people in the home or didn't want to go to an office where the baby, could get exposed to different things. One participant noted that the telehealth was better for how their family interacted with each other. And also, a participant noted that they have a difficult work schedule. So this allowed them to kind of wake up, join in on the meeting, they could sign off and go back to sleep. So it just was a little bit less disruptive to that participant's work schedule and lifestyle. Some provider advantages that they noted were special features of Zoom, like a whiteboard, helped with the interactivity of the meeting. Some providers felt that certain youth, maybe those with some social anxiety or some different symptoms like that, might be more open to doing a virtual meeting. One provider noted that the platform was helpful in sticking to some of the ground rules of meetings. So, if you have your Zoom set to have like the speaker pop up, then the other people know that person's speaking, they hold off to add their comments. So it might help some families to stop from talking over each other. And as I mentioned earlier, the advantage of providers might be able to more likely to attend if they just have to sort of sign on to a meeting rather than travel to one. And this might also perhaps be helpful for natural support people as well who may not be able to travel and take that time out of their schedule to get to the meeting. Some disadvantages of virtual meetings are billing specifications. So certain services may not be, or areas you might not be allowed to provide the services virtually and still bill for them, which is definitely a consideration. Some felt that they were better able to connect in person. Of course, we mentioned connectivity and device issues still may be very real for certain individuals. And in the same way that virtual meetings may be better for some youth with certain symptoms or challenges, it also may be more challenging for other youth, as we mentioned, like those with learning difficulties, maybe also attention challenges, things like that. Excuse me. So participants noted some of these disadvantages, not having reliable service and devices, and also the disadvantage of not being able to get all those nonverbals on the camera versus in person, as reasons why they still preferred in-person meetings. Some disadvantages that were noted from providers was some difficulties engaging. Even if families do have devices and reliable internet, they may not be tech savvy, which is a good point. Especially maybe some of the elderly participants may not be as familiar with the technology. And some families, they're okay with virtual, but they still, maybe would be a little bit better with the face-to-face. And then, of course, you always have, it depends. So some participants mentioned like if they usually like in person, but they just had surgery, so now they went Zoom. Others noted that Zoom can be efficient for some things. So perhaps some parts of the service are in person, others are going to be virtual to make some efficiencies. And then another participant expressed that with her daughter's needs, that it just might depend from day to day. One day she might prefer virtual, one day in person. So just depends on this particular day for that person. And then for the providers, as I mentioned, video meetings may not be better for older generations that don't have as much experience with them. Um, in-person participation is ideal, but the fact that you can have people join in virtually more easily, like informal supports and formal supports, that is an advantage. So it's kind of on the fence. And then noting that for some working families, the virtual meetings might be better, even though in person maybe are better in general. So lots of great, great feedback from both our providers and the participants. So some of the takeaways I wanted to share were we're seeing similar effectiveness for both virtual and in-person meetings. So it's not, what type of meeting is not impacting some of our important outcomes like phase at discharge, graduation, and out-of-home placements. Meeting frequency was impacted by type of meeting. So those with more virtual meetings do seem to be having more meetings and having meetings more closely together. Although virtual infrastructure is another takeaway. So although we had some concerns going into it about families lacking access to devices and connectivity to participate in virtual meetings, these limitations were pretty rare. And the preference was interesting as well, that 55% of families reported a preference for the in-person meetings. So it seems like both meeting types have some positives. So virtual meetings are probably easier for teams with more formal supports, families with health concerns, and families with challenging schedules. Whereas in-person meetings are better with families with youth with certain challenges like learning difficulties that may make focusing in a virtual meeting more challenging. And just opening up the question of the possibility of perhaps a hybrid approach. So this could look like either certain elements of wraparound are happening in person versus virtually. For instance, maybe the engagement part is happening in person and then some of the later meetings are happening virtually, or that the family can specify their preference. So perhaps the whole process could occur either virtually or in person, depending on what works best for that family. And some of the next steps and suggestions. A great next step would be to identify those processes and procedures that are best suited for virtual versus in-person delivery. I wish we had that data. I would love to be able to inform that process, but just intuitively, you would, as I mentioned, probably initial engagement would be best occurring in person. Although the limitations due to devices and connectivities are very rare, they're still very real for some families and are a big barrier to care. So it might be helpful for providers to ask these questions at the beginning of care. So if it's something like they don't have a device, the families or the providers could work with that family to maybe obtain a device if possible, or at least they know in advance if it is a connectivity issue that virtual care is probably not going to be an option for that family. And some families may prefer virtual meetings in certain circumstances like illness or poor weather. So that would be another thing that would be helpful to ask the family at the beginning of care, so you don't have to sort of figure it out on the fly. Like if you know the family prefers virtual meetings in poor weather, you can facilitate that process when you know that bad weather is coming rather than having to figure it out at the last minute. And even for in-person meetings, it's probably still helpful, at least from the feedback we've received from providers, to have a virtual option if possible so that formal support providers can join meetings. It's really challenging to get some of these formal support providers to meetings, so having it as convenient as possible, I think, is really, really helpful for them and will make it a lot more likely for them to be able to attend. All right. So that is all I have today. Molly, were there any questions, or if anybody has any questions now?
Yes. Please feel free to share your questions in either the chat or the Q&A. I think we can handle them both. I'll ask a quick one while people think about their questions. And first, just thank you so much. It was fascinating, and I'm so glad you're able to capture some of that information. Given the need to shift things so quickly, and you never know if you're asking the right things because you didn't plan for this, right? None of us did. So I'm really glad you're able to do that. I'm wondering, I'm guessing probably you didn't have this data, but did you have any data about the length of time that the meetings lasted? I'm wondering if maybe meetings were shorter virtually.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, we don't have the data on the length of meetings, but that would be really interesting. I would guess maybe they're shorter virtually, but I'm just guessing.
Yep, yep. That was my assumption, probably. So you didn't have that data, you would have shared it with us.
Yes.
All right. Well, I am not seeing any questions in the chat box. Um, so I want to thank you so much for your time today and for the presentation. It was wonderful. I think we've all learned quite a bit.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And my last slide is just my contact information. So if you do have some questions pop up later or you were interested in learning more, feel free to send me an email.
Yes. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.